Well, an avowed Democratic Socialist is now the frontrunner, or is he? I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, we are now almost 48 hours out following the New Hampshire primary, where, to the nation's surprise, we actually had some results in the wake of Iowa, which still doesn't have accurate full results. But in any case, what we found is that in the popular vote, Bernie Sanders edged Mayor Pete Buttigieg, or former Mayor Pete Buttigieg, by a small margin, a couple of thousand votes, but they both came away with the same number of delegates. And currently, after two states, a caucus and a primary, Pete Buttigieg actually leads by about 2 delegates over Bernie Sanders. The surprise of the night, of course, was Amy Klobuchar, who came from, I believe it was a distant 5th place in Iowa, to come in 3rd, and a relatively strong 3rd, garnering almost 20% of the popular vote there, and actually capturing a few delegates coming out of New Hampshire. And so this kind of changes the field. And Bill, realizing that we are now, a day or so out, and so this isn't breaking news, I'd like to focus more on kind of analysis of where we are at this point in the race. Nevada is still about a week and a half ahead of us, followed by South Carolina, and then the Super Tuesday primaries in early March. It struck me, a couple of things struck me about the result in New Hampshire. Number one is, and let's start here, Bernie Sanders kicked Hillary Clinton's tail in 2016 in New Hampshire. But here he captured just about 26% of the vote, with Pete Buttigieg coming up close behind at 24%. What do you make of the fact that in a neighboring state with much more notoriety and name recognition and a stronger ground game than he had last time around, he turned in a relatively modest, if not weak, performance there?
Who did?
Sanders.
Yeah. Before we get into that, it's probably a question you've got later, but seriously, listening to you announce the results, the thing that's most striking about the New Hampshire results is not the names that are there, but the name that's missing, right? I mean, that's the story.
Yes, it is. And Joe Biden, in fact, left the state before his so-called victory celebration in New Hampshire and gave what seemed to be a rather awkward speech upon arrival in South Carolina, where he did almost nothing but pander to African-American and Latino voters, and actually praised the upcoming primary state, or caucus state, rather, of Nevada, as he praised them for their diversity. So he's still hanging on that South Carolina is the firewall.
Nevada sure enough is a cultural milieu for those of you who have ever been to Nevada. Anyway, I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute. Yes, it's all very, very, very interesting, and I think all of us are caught a little by surprise. I don't think anybody's surprised at how badly Joe Biden's doing. I'm not surprised by it. I am very surprised at how fast he's doing badly. That was and remains quite a shock for me. It's hard to tell. Iowa, it's a caucus, and we don't really know what happened out there. So Iowa's always a little off the mean, But New Hampshire is a long-established history of being basically the first of the primaries in the country. And New Hampshire, this will be breaking news for some of you, is a northeastern state, and the Northeast has always been a little isolated in terms of the rest of the country. It's hard to imagine Bernie Sanders being governor of Tennessee. So the fact that right next door, Bernie Sanders didn't do as strongly as he thought he might, or as he did last year relative to Hillary Clinton, is an indication that his case may not be as strong as possible. Buttigieg seems to me to be, more than anything, to be the guy filling the vacuum right now left by the fact that nobody wants to vote for Joe Biden again. And I think what's going to be really interesting is South Carolina, because South Carolina is outside of that kind of liberal northeastern bubble. Whether or not the two things I'm going to be interested in South Carolina, I think Joe Biden at this point is probably done. Nobody's even heard the name Elizabeth What's-Her-Name for the last 2-3 weeks. So the two big questions for me going forward, and these are the big questions, are how well is Bernie Sanders going to do when it actually comes time to vote in America? And secondly, does Buttigieg have any any traction in terms of the working people of the country, you know, the real working class crowds. You can't really call New Hampshire a working class state. That's not to insult the people who are working in New Hampshire. It's not a southern state. It's not a California or a mid-Atlantic state. I know I'm stating the obvious, but here's where I'm trying to go with this, Scotty. America is essentially 7 different countries, something like that. You've got these 7 different cultural mini countries that are all stitched together. And the Northeast, the New England Northeast is one of them. The Mid-Atlantic seaboard is one. The South, the Deep South is one. The Southwest is another country. The Northwest is another country. California is a country all to itself. The Midwest is a country, and so on. And when you really take a look at how national elections break out, you find that the Northeast has traditionally gone very liberal, but it usually doesn't make much of a difference. And that seems to be the case here. So yeah, it is interesting that Bernie didn't do as well as he did. And the fact that Amy is on the boards all of a sudden, again, seems to me to be, look, there's a mad dash in the Democratic Party now. I mean, a crazed, insane, what the hell are we going to do dash. I know this must be true because I read it in the LA Times yesterday. But basically what's happening is as the Biden, for the entire last 6 months to a year almost, he's been an assertion. It's been asserted that Biden will be the standard bearer. It's been asserted that Biden is the electable one. Everybody's asserted this. This is what the establishment has told us and the news media has told us. The problem for Biden is that the voters get a say, and the voters are not too impressed with Joe Biden.
You know, what's striking about the outcome of New Hampshire, I think, in many ways, if you forget the personalities and just look at what people voted for, some 26% of them voted for an avowed so-called Democratic socialist. However, 75% of the Democratic voters, and lots of those are independents, and they allow same-day registration, and I believe Republicans can also vote in that primary. So what you found is 75% of people said, no, we don't want a socialist, and about 40%, what was it? So Amy had about 20, Pete had about 24, and so we're about 44%. If you combine the two collections of votes for moderate candidates, they really drubbed Bernie Sanders, and the only reason why the vote was split there is because of personality difference or what people think of Pete versus Amy. But if you essentially created a candidate called Pete Amy, Pete Amy would have killed Bernie Sanders.
Yes, in New Hampshire, in the liberal Northeast.
Well, it's only Democrats voting anyway. Or you're just saying
but hold on. My point is that this didn't happen in Texas or Tennessee or South Carolina. This happened in New Hampshire.
So it's more surprising that moderate Democrats did well in a highly liberal Northeast state, is what you're saying.
Let me simply twist that around to make it a little clearer. It's more surprising that Bernie didn't do as well in the liberal Northeast as he did in New Hampshire. If you take Pete Amy, and I'm using round numbers here, obviously, but you're finding that Democrats in New England voted 2-1 against socialism. That's, I think, a legitimate way to look at the election results from New Hampshire.
And I think that's probably a fair way of looking at it, too. The other thing that happened, or frankly didn't happen, is the surge of new voters that they expected. Bernie Sanders had been predicting. It hasn't happened in Iowa. It didn't happen in New Hampshire, that there would be this flood of people who are rallying around Medicare for all, free college tuition, student loan debt forgiveness, and all of these things that are allegedly the heartbeat of what the Democratic Party is, according to Bernie Sanders. He didn't get a surge.
Well, the lack of a surge is important, and it's important for a much more important reason. Bernie Sanders may assert that free college tuition is the heartbeat of the Democratic Party, but anybody that's been watching the Democratic Party for the last 3 years knows that the heartbeat of the Democratic Party is anything but Trump. Anything to get rid of Trump, anything. And much bigger than them not turning out for Bernie's social programs is the fact that they didn't turn out at all. In other words, if the Democrats' entire campaign strategy for 2020 was to spend 2016 to 2020 tarring Donald Trump with everything they had in the hopes of creating this massive tidal wave of fury on the part of the voters, it ain't working at all. And they're not only not coming out for Bernie, they're not coming out for Democrats. Anecdotal reports are worth the paper they're written on, right? It's just stories. Nevertheless, sometimes they can catch a mood. And when you combine the number of Democrats that seem to have been really disgusted by Nancy Pelosi tearing up the Trump speech, I'm not saying they suddenly left the Democratic Party because Pelosi tore up a speech, but I am saying that Pelosi tearing up the speech was the final straw for a number of Democrats who have watched their party just go ever further to the left. So anecdotally, we're finding out that there seem to be significant numbers of Democrats at Donald Trump rallies. And if that's true, it's over. I mean, you never want to say it's over. Always things can happen. And the last thing you want is complacency. And the last thing you want is for people to not come out and vote because they think you're going to win. But if you look at it that way, Scott, if you look at the overall turnout, in order for the Democrats to have a good shot of unseating Donald Trump, they need large numbers of Democrats to turn out for whoever the nominee is. They're going to need large numbers to turn out because the Republican base is fired up by this impeachment thing. And in Iowa and in New Hampshire, so far, that hasn't happened. So that's number one. That's bad news for them. Second piece of bad news is that they don't have a breakaway frontrunner, even if that person is Bernie Sanders. What we're finding from New Hampshire is even if Bernie is the one generating the most enthusiasm and has the most kind of solid base in terms of primaries, he's not exactly crushing the competition. So that's bad news for them. And then the final piece of bad news is the main piece that's been there since 2006, well, since 2018, really, since the midterms. And that is that AOC and the rest of the crew have staked out such a radical position that all of the Democrats, when they're all 26 of them or whatever, all of them had to move left in order to not lose the people that AOC was staking out, the loud, pretty small majority by the results of the elections anyway, of the social justice crowd. And so the whole panel, the whole slate of candidates has moved far off to the left. And what it looks like to me very, very clearly is in the space of just really, honest to God, honestly, just as a result of Iowa, and Iowa was a catastrophe. What we found coming out of it, I think, in this whole, we're already two whole primaries into this, but looking at it as it is now, it seems pretty clear that the whole Biden campaign from the beginning was a soap bubble inflated by the media and the Democratic Party in order to preserve some chance of winning this thing. The people don't like Joe. They never did like Joe. And Joe has not made it easy to like him. So
Bill,
now
can I interject here for a second,
Sure.
Bill? Because it seems to me that you're not alone in this, but you and others I've seen on the right commenting on this seem much more intent on talking about Joe Biden's failure than about the people who were successful. I guess I'm wondering, are you concerned that Joe Biden makes a better punching bag in a general election than some of these other candidates do?
No, it's not a punching bag issue at all. I wouldn't mind facing Joe Biden, but at this point, I'm not too worried about facing anybody. This is not a pile up on Joe, Scott. This isn't like, hey, let's kick Biden while it's down. This is an analysis of what the Democrats have put forward as their strategy for the last year. That Joe Biden was going to be the standard bearer, that Joe Biden was electable, that Joe Biden was the force of reason, that Joe Biden was the front runner. I didn't make all this stuff up. I didn't decide to say that. That's how he's been promoted. And that's how he's been promoted by the media.
Well, that's how he's been promoting himself. And you're right. The media has picked up that song and assumed because of the coattails of Barack Obama and his vast experience and his reaching across the aisle and his good old Joe guy that would happen. The country's been disabused of that now, haven't they?
Well, how can they be completely disabused of it? I mean, I'm not trying to be snippy here, but you're making it sound like the idea that the presumptive frontrunner simply evaporating after two whole primaries is not somehow news. It's the news. It's the news. The guy who was touted as the guy most likely to beat Donald Trump absolutely flamed out. He never got off the deck, catapulted into the water, had a cold shot into the water, boom, off he goes. And now that vehicle is sinking. And this is the news. It was going to be it looked like it was going to be a serious fight between Bernie and Joe. Joe's gone. you would think that that would mean that Bernie numbers would be even better, but they're not. And that's telling me a couple things. Number one, their entire strategy with Joe Biden was faulty. Number two, their strategy of betting everything on people hating Trump was faulty because they're not turning out in huge waves. And number three, Bernie Sanders' support, while vocal, is limited. It is limited to a specific sector of the population that is turning out 25, 30%, maybe 40% of the Democratic primary votes. But if all you can do is break 30% of the Democratic primary votes, you've got no chance at all. And if you're the front runner, you're doomed. So what's going to happen, I suspect, are going to be two things that would be really, really interesting. I think that Bernie is going to maintain somewhere around 20 or 25% in relatively liberal states. I don't think he'll do as well in the rest of the country. So that's going to reduce his threat factor. But the real story, the real thing to watch, will be watching the people who either had thought they would vote for Biden or didn't want to think about it or disappointed in him, whatever. All of that gigantic block of the so-called sensible Democrats, the blue-collar workers that have always been the base of that party, who always were assumed to just fall right onto the malarkey bus, they've got to go someplace.
And about half the people in New Hampshire who voted for Amy Klobuchar said they made up their minds in the final 72 hours. Let me finish up this way, Bill, because I actually watched the victory speeches, or they're not all victory speeches, I guess. I watched the after-action speeches of Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar. And I was interested to see not only their approaches to how they did that, but the audience reaction. By far and away, the most enthusiastic audience was for Bernie Sanders. And I would guess that that would have been the same if he had finished in sixth place rather than tied for first, essentially. And so the very enthusiastic response. He seemed kind of impatient with their incessant clapping. He shouted some proposals about giving away free things, and then everybody cheered, and off the stage he went.
That's the Bernie Sanders biography. You got it in one sentence.
So Pete Buttigieg came out and frankly has a presence and a bearing as he walks onto the stage that looks a lot more presidential than really anybody else in the field. He just carries himself like somebody who's been in command and knows how to lead something. And he had a lot of enthusiastic chanting of President Pete and things like that. But there was a moment in that speech, in an otherwise very well-received speech, where he said this, and I want to quote, "Americans want the freedom to make choices for themselves on health care or on any other issue, not to have Washington decide for them. And the politics of my way or the highway is a road to re-electing Donald Trump. Vulnerable Americans do not have the luxury of pursuing ideological purity over an inclusive victory." Now, he's clearly going after Bernie Sanders in that whole thing there. And I will tell you, that line fell like a lead balloon in that room. And the cheering that had been going on for the previous 9 minutes literally just died. And there was this sort of one guy golf clap that happened after that. So go ahead.
So basically the audience said, "Yay, we got a young, good-looking communist." What? Yeah. Sweet. That's actually great news. That's great news. My worry about Buttigieg would be, as we mentioned in a couple of other shows, would be a sort of a repeat of what Barack Obama was able to do. You got a young, good-looking, charismatic guy with no experience that people are projecting their own hopes and dreams onto without him having to make any kind of commitments. And so now what Buttigieg is doing, sensibly enough, you would think, is saying, all right, now it's looking like for some miracle has happened. Now it's starting to look like me and Bernie, and I've got to break away from Bernie. I've got to pull the sensible people who don't want to give everything away to buy votes. I got to give them some ground to stand on. And the second he offers that, it turns out crickets, So that's telling me that the Democratic Party has yet another divide in it. And that is the divide between the people that want the cranky old lunatic socialist versus the ones that want the smooth, young, handsome gay socialist. But I think the problem was he said a line there that made him sound like he wasn't a socialist. But that's my point. That's my point. When they realize that Buttigieg is actually trying to position himself away from Bernie and get towards something a little more sensible, they're going, what happened to our young, handsome, gay socialist? They don't know what to do. I've never seen a field like in this kind of disarray. Well, I take that back. The Republican field in 2016 was in this kind of disarray. And by the way, this is, I think, a really important point. Look at what happened in 2016 when the Republicans had this enormous field of players and Hillary basically had it locked up. Well, it looked like Hillary anyway. What you saw was, as time went on, as the debates went on and more people fell off the stage, it began to dawn on people that Donald Trump is like actually serious. He's like a contender here. And then as he started to get into where actual voting happened, he showed tremendous strength. And one by one, the former shoo-ins, Jeb Bush and all these guys, all the way up to Ted Cruz, just fall by the wayside because of this outsider. I think Bernie represents that outsider to the left. That's not a huge insight, but I think what is an interesting thing to think about is, what will the Never Bernie crowd look like? Because there is a Never Bernie crowd inside the Democratic Party. James Carville, we did a show on just yesterday, is simply the latest person to comment on the Never Bernie crowd. What happens when Bernie starts to get strong enough? Does a Never Bernie movement, they won't call it that obviously, but does a Never Bernie movement actually start to coalesce? And if it does, who does it coalesce around?
And that's the question, and that segues to the final analysis. Amy Klobuchar came out and gave her speech and started out basically by saying, "Hello, America. My name is Amy Klobuchar," introducing herself to the American public. There was perhaps a subtle distinction between her approach to ending the division, that to going up against the divider in chief, as they call Donald Trump, was something that is not divisive. When Pete Buttigieg talked about the coalition that came together to get him that close to victory in New Hampshire, he said Democrats, he said independents, and he said newly former Republicans. However, when Amy Klobuchar said it, she said Democrats and independents and moderate Republicans. And then she pointed out the fact that she had won, as she won her Senate seat to the surprise of everybody. She's the first female senator from her state, that she won in the reddest of red districts and she won in the bluest of blue districts. And she didn't give that subtle dig at the Republican Party that Pete did. And then she did something that, frankly, Pete has a harder time doing. She connected emotionally. Her speech was the only one where I actually got a tear in my eye as she talked about her grandfather being a miner and her parents who had saved up money in a coffee can, or grandparents who saved up money in a coffee can to send her dad to community college. And there was a lot more to the story than this. But what I saw there reminded me of what you've said before about the exit polling in the Obama-Romney race, where people came out of the polls and said Mitt Romney would be better at almost everything that makes for a good president, and Barack Obama cares about people like me. And it seemed to me that Amy Klobuchar strummed that chord on the electoral guitar.
Yes, and in 2012, when you've only had 4 years of Obama ruin, which I'm sure could still blame on Bush, they certainly tried to, you could use that he likes me kind of thing for a shot at another 4 years. You've got a strong candidate in terms of charisma. We're looking back on it. We're suddenly realizing that Mitt Romney maybe didn't put his entire soul into that fight in 2012. But things are different now. The Democrats cannot just get by on, that seems like a nice person. You've got a guy who's despised by the Democrats, no question about that. But you also have an economy that is just ringing, and that is the issue. So in order for them to overcome Trump on economic issues, they've got to have a unified team, and they've got to have a very strong, charismatic candidate who can garner the kind of confidence that make people want to come out and vote for. I agree with you completely that Amy's striking the right notes, and it's still very early. You don't want to write anything off, and I'm sure we'll see her get significant increases in the time to come. But to be honest with you, Scott, I think it's just too late for her this time around anyway. If she has to introduce herself in New Hampshire, the time to introduce yourself was during the last year. The time for you to stand out and start to gain some recognition was all of this last year during the debates. She didn't get any traction at all. So I really don't know if it's if even if I think there will be a late rally to her, because right now she's coming out of New Hampshire as one of the top three candidates, and one of the two who represent some kind of sense of centrism, and the least obnoxious of the two. All of that, but for her to come out and say, "Hello, America, I'm Amy Klobuchar," while charming and effective, both, is an indication that she has enormous amounts of work to do. And we're not talking about senator or even governor here. We're talking about president of the United States. I don't think people are going to discover somebody in the primaries that then goes on to become the nominee unless that person were spectacular. And I mean spectacular, like George Clooney kind of thing. And I just don't think she's got that kind of charisma. So, look, from a Democratic point of view, I don't see how anything got resolved. I think things just got muddier. From a Republican point of view, I'm pretty happy. And Nevada aside, with all of its rich diversity, the real issue obviously is going to be South Carolina. South Carolina is going to show us South Carolina will determine whether Joe is in the race or gone. South Carolina will tell us what Bernie Sanders' strength is outside of the liberal Northeast. South Carolina will tell us to some degree how much traction Pete Buttigieg actually gets. And then South Carolina will also be an opportunity for people to just watch these last two debacles to firm up their opinion on whether they want to go with Amy or whether Bloomberg is starting to look good for them. But from a Republican point of view, all I see is things getting more fractured, not less. Couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of guys.
The members of BillWhittle.com have made this program possible, and we're grateful for their contributions to this effort. Many of them will be joining us aboard the Navigator of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean cruise ship leaving out of the port of Miami on May 15th for a 3-night cruise to the Bahamas, stopping for a day at a private island called Coco Key, and along the way enjoying staged productions before a live studio audience of this show and the other productions at BillWhittle.com. If you'd like to be part of that, not just the formal kind of audience events, but also the casual conversations over dinner and drinks and lots of laughter and making friends that you'll probably keep for life, then go to BillWhittle.com and click on the picture of that Royal Caribbean cruise ship. Time is a wasting, and we're almost down to the end of when you can actually sign up for it. So make sure you do that today. And now that you're done watching this video, by the way, the next step is to go over to the Patriot Post. We'll provide a link in the description below, because we know that the best way to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in this country is to watch this show. But if you want to see like a text version of this show, then go to the Patriot Post. numbers of the multiple yes. Great stories a day. Yes, and you're going to really enjoy that. They're doing a great job. It's a beautiful website. So click on that link in the description below. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.